Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I am being joined on stage for the panel entitled The Future of Cannabis Testing. Although I would like to acknowledge that these people have really been leaders in the industry for the past 5 years. I think everyone on the stage has been testing cannabis since stringent regulations were even passed in the state. So not only have they kind of driven the direction of where cannabis is going to be, but they've already kind of set the standard for where it is now. So I would just like to give them a couple of minutes to introduce themselves to the audience so you know who you're talking to. So first, Savino.
Good morning. I'm Savino Sguera. I've been testing cannabis in the analytical setting for the last 8 years, working on mostly method development, method validations according to different state and federal regulations, everything from pesticides to cannabinoids and everything in between.
I'm Stephen Goldman. I'm the laboratory director of a testing facility in Denver, Colorado called Phytotech. We opened in 2013, so going on 6 years now. And we've been lucky enough to test over 150,000 compliant samples and many tens of thousands more R&D, so starting to get to a place where we can really leverage the data set that we've acquired.
Good morning. My name is Afia, currently scientific director at CannaSafe Labs. I'd like to believe the largest lab and the world's first accredited lab in cannabis. Current market shareholder, testing just about over a third of the products that go on the shelves here in California.
Good morning. I'm Cindy Orser. I'm the Chief Science Officer for DigiPath Labs. It's a testing lab in Las Vegas. I have been practicing science for over 30 years. I got my PhD at UC Berkeley, where I worked on biogenic ice nucleation, which is a fascinating topic I'd love to tell you all about one day. It's basically responsible for frost injury worldwide. I consider myself an innovator. Starting with my PhD, I came up with a way to control frost injury, but the EPA prevented that product from ever moving forward. We actually filed the first environmental impact statement for GMO. So that was very interesting, sort of set the stage for my career. I've worked across many disciplines, from toxicology, trying to create a way to measure human mutation rate, describing dehalogenation reactions, how microorganisms co-opt existing function to break down man-made chemicals. I've developed rapid diagnostics for Homeland Security for biological toxins. And about 6 years ago, I fell into what I call the black hole of cannabis testing. When a headhunter contacted me and asked if I would be interested in building out a cannabis testing lab for a public company in Las Vegas. And actually, one of my first hires was Afia, and I could not have done it without him. It was an amazing experience starting out with basically nothing. There were no validated methods. There were few certified reference standards, so it really was quite an undertaking.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Andrew Pham from Alchemist Labs. We are a DEA-registered botanical testing lab with over 20 years of experience in the lab testing industry. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you for caring about lab testing. There's a lot of reasons to care about lab testing, and I don't think you need to go any further than to look at the news and think about the vaping crisis that's affecting hundreds of people across the country. The CDC has reported over 300 to 500 cases for both nicotine and cannabis-related vapes, most of them sourced from the black market. And I just really wanted to ask the panelists, do you think lab testing could have prevented this crisis, or do you think it's too soon to say?
Well, I think that lab testing, as it currently stands, wouldn't have prevented this crisis because we're not looking for the things that are supposedly causing this vape crisis. So we've heard a lot about vitamin E acetate, a little bit about mineral oil being and other dopants being added to the vape carts in order to dilute the product or to keep a proper consistency. But unfortunately, we don't. Those aren't common things that are tested for in an analytical laboratory because they're not contaminants. As well, a lot of the manufacturers don't disclose the ingredients. They keep them proprietary, and so a lab wouldn't know. And until regulations change in which they have to start disclosing these things, we might continue to see this.
Yeah, in Colorado there are it's an open market, so there's about 3,000 licenses. Many, but not all of which test with our company, and less than 10% of them test what's outside of the required testing panel. So it's definitely the minority of companies that are looking at these things. We do almost zero raw materials testing in the state. A lot of the manufacturers are just now learning what GMP or good manufacturing practices are. So I think it's just in its infancy right now. We're not quite to the point where we're starting to think about assessing risks and minimizing risks during manufacturing. So I agree. I don't think testing would have caught this process.
Correct. Jumping on that, lab testing wouldn't have prevented this, but it's important to note when the issue did begin, it was pertinent for labs to jump on it and provide as much information as possible, which CannaSafe did, quickly developing a method for vitamin E acetate. Although it's not known to be the culprit, but it's a common denominator in these illicit vape carts, we actually went out and bought a lot of illicit vape carts and tested them ourselves, along with some of our clients' products, and noticed that, yes, they contain high levels, some up to 40% of vitamin E acetate oil, with low label claims and pretty much at least 10 to 20 different pesticides. So it's not quite known what is the cause, but contribution of all of these factors could be very disastrous. So it's important, although labs don't test for this excipients and whatnot, it's important to jump on it as soon as we feel that public safety is at risk. And I think it's a responsibility for the labs in the state to get on this. Additionally, perhaps if the federal government made this federally legal, it would allow for, or not allow for, some of these black market players to be in the space and perhaps increase consumer safety.
Yeah, I think the whole vape cartridge issue we're facing right now was fully expected by myself, that's for certain. 4 years ago, I wrote a blog on the unknown hazards of vaping. There's a myriad of issues, starting with the fact, as was already mentioned, that the producers don't have to list the ingredients that they put in there. State regulators are so far in over their heads, they don't even realize the complexity of these products and the pending health crisis that we could be witnessing. I think the industry for the first time is going to see class action lawsuits because now these companies are making enough money and there are enough individuals that are being impacted. There was a case study that was in the news from the UK, a 19-year-old individual who had been vaping for 2 years, and they shared the x-rays of his lungs. They were like half full of a substance that resembled bacon grease. I don't think it's a good idea to inhale lipids or to inhale oil droplets. And this points to the lack of oversight in this industry. And I think that we should all come together and require stricter standards. There have never been any inhalation studies. I mean, the tobacco industry got off without having to conduct these studies for decades and decades. I think that we should insist that we see some animal inhalation studies done on the constituents that are used in these products.
honestly, I'd like to jump on that. That's important because I think a lot of producers out there use ingredients that, they tout as GRAS status by the FDA, generally recognized as safe. But those studies weren't done in inhalation. So yeah, you can rub vitamin E acetate or vitamin E oil topically, but it's never been studied what happens when you ignite and inhale.
Right, and there's in Germany, there's a list of what are the ingredients that can go in beer. And here it's just totally up to the imagination of the producer. I mean, yesterday we heard in the terpene talk that some of these vape fluids are up to 60% terpenes. So terpenes are also oils, and they can penetrate your skin, they can coat your tissue. I think one of the positives out of this could be that there will be a return to vaping flower, which I consider to be the most effective and safe way of using cannabis.
So thank you very much for your thoughtful responses. It kind of seems like there's a very interesting consensus here that you all acknowledge that the current state of cannabis testing probably wouldn't have prevented this crisis from happening. So in your opinions, what in the future do you think, what kind of new regulations or new standards of testing should be implemented in order to prevent this from happening?
Well, as far as regulations go, they could start regulating what sort of diluents and other additive ingredients should be allowed. And it should be a very restrictive list, and it shouldn't be very many things. We shouldn't be allowed to add anything cheap or untested into that. Even a lot of manufacturers will use propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, and these aren't necessarily the greatest things ever, but they're highly prevalent in the tobacco industry, in the nicotine vape industry. And so until all of these things start coming under a set of monitoring lists that will look for some of these additives and regulate them, I don't think there's anything we can do. And as an aside, all of these vape carts were all illegal. They were not being monitored. They were not being sold on any legitimate market. And so until we make an effort to bridge the legal and illegal markets, we won't be able to control this.
Yeah, I would say, even simpler than that. In Colorado, there's no approval process for a product. So if you want to make a product with a cannabinoid in it, you do that and then you sell it. And as long as you're not contributing, flower to the black market, there's very little that will stop you to do that. One example of the openness of the market is our nasal spray products, which started appearing on the market. And we asked the regulators at the Department of Public Health, are you concerned with applying products that could have, very sensitive microbial agents in them directly on someone's mucosal membrane? And they said, they're selling those on the market right now? So there's literally no oversight or product approval process or thought to what additives and risks are going into these products.
We were discussing earlier whether these are acute toxicities or due to long-term exposure. I think Cindy kind of touched on it earlier, in that essentially we're all, guinea pigs in this, right? So people have been vaping probably the illicit black market material for quite a while now, and now it's becoming a problem. So what other issues are we going to see from long-term exposure to these toxins? Regulation-wise, it'll be very difficult to enact regulation to stop some of these excipients or diluents from being used because, well, to do that, you need to perform a study, right? And generally, it's a long-term thing, and I don't see that happening overnight. And you can't just, handicap the cannabis industry from producing vape products. But I would like to say this while you guys are out here. This city, I don't believe, has legal shops yet. So as you're, enjoying your products, just be careful what you buy out there. That there are a lot of illicit stuff out there, even mimicking licensed vendors.
So I think first and foremost, the producers should be required to list exactly what they're putting in their products. That would just be a first step. So full disclosure that you at least would know what you're vaping into your lungs. I think we probably have gotten to this point because the industry is light years ahead of the regulators because this is such a creative, fast-moving space. But overall, I think it points to the issues that surround this industry because of the disconnect from state and federal levels. And I think that's what has let the black market explode in the vape cartridges. They're so easy to make. You don't have to say what's in them. We have the synthetic cannabinoid issue as well that could be a culprit in this. But it's really because we have not had federal public funding to do basic research so that we can actually understand what are the health impacts of not only the cannabinoids and the terpenes, but some of these excipients. So it would be just really great if there was a source of federal money so that we could do the proper basic inhalation studies.
I think a good word to touch on is probably transparency then. If they're required to list what's in their product, then I think manufacturers need to be more transparent in doing that. And cultivators need to be transparent in how they grow their products as well, with pesticides, EPM, stuff like that. But kind of pivoting, just as importantly, is that testing labs need to be transparent with their methods as well. So it's a very common complaint. I'm sure you've all heard this, that you can send a sample to 10 different labs and get 10 different results. And some of that is on us and some of that isn't, but there's a million reasons why that happens. And I was wondering if you guys could kind of share the intricacies of why there are inconsistencies between results from different labs and what we can do to kind of fix that.
So it's definitely a multi-part answer. So first of all, the plant, if you're talking about cannabis flower, the plant itself will vary in potency by up to 15% that we found in some of our tests that we've done between laboratories as sort of a gauge to see, okay, everybody's testing this different, why is that? So we send the same sample to all these different laboratories and see how everyone reports back. And different parts of the plant have tested up to 15% of the value as being different. And this is talking about THC percentage in particular. And then as well, you have the methodologies. Everybody's methodology comes with a certain amount of what they call uncertainty. And so when you have a certain amount of uncertainty, that can make you release a result, you say that's 26%, but actually it could be really between 24 and 28%. And this exists in every other industry. It exists in pharmaceuticals, it exists in environmental lab testing, and so that's what we need to educate the consumers, the cultivators a little more to say, hey, when you get a result, the result, we report it as this, but there's actually a swing from here to here, and that really depends on everybody's methodology, equipment, practices and whatnot, but every laboratory should have that number calculated, and so it should be known to anybody who is actually compliant with BCC and ISO regulations.
Yeah, in Colorado, the Department of Public Health actually mediates an interlab proficiency test study. I think a lot of you are familiar with the protocol, but there's a 13-page document that describes how the Department of Public Health actually homogenizes flour and sends it out to the lab. So 13 pages just to make sure that the sample is homogeneous. So a lot does go into it on the sampling side, but I do want to reinforce the idea of transparency. We're maybe a little too aggressive with our clients as well in trying to bring them into our lab, show them our methods, force them to look at our method validations, to see our method uncertainty, because those are the types of things that are going to, bring awareness to the consumer end, that those are the questions that need to be asked on the lab side as well.
I think that's important. Method uncertainties is a required calculation on the newest revision of ISO 17025:2017, and that's something we've performed at our lab, taking into account all the different factors that may aid to uncertainties, technician, pipetting, whatnot, and unfortunately, it's not reported in the COA due to various reasons. For one, it's not required by the state, but it can always be asked by our client what those uncertainty values are, and Savino, they're totally right. there is a wide range, and a lot of things factor into that. Apart from your method uncertainties, is statistical sampling. Generally, when you get the complaints, it would be from a client who sent one bud to one lab, one bud to another lab, but there were two different samples. So you can expect to get the same results out of that. Even the spread of things like mycotoxins or pesticides are not homogeneous throughout the plants if you do apply them. So it's really difficult to say that, whether you can't compare apples to apples in this case. So I think it's important for labs to really work on, not labs, but industry, just think of statistical sampling, homogeneity. How does that play into what values you get from the labs? And how are you really offering up that? And one way we see this difference is, or one group that does it well is, let's say in terms of the emerald testing, running that and sending to labs across the nation and applying statistical analysis to the values that are reported. What is the spread? If we have a certain homogeneous sample that's sent through, that would be the factor to consider. That would be where to look. How are the labs really different from each other apart from their method uncertainties, as opposed to just a random sample that a client or somebody sent two different samples to two different labs.
Obviously, I agree with everything that was said. So, collectively, this is all called measurement uncertainty. As Ini said, that's a term common in analytical chemistry, but not widely understood by the regulators. And as Ini said, it is a ISO 17025 requirement now to determine your measurement uncertainty for every analyte you measure in the lab. And typically a measurement uncertainty in our lab for cannabinoids is 6%. That's not 6 points, so it's not like 20% versus 26%, it's 0.06 of that 20%. And also in analytical chemistry, a plus or minus 15% is pretty good. So if you are coming in with a 30% THCA value, that means you should accept or expect a range of 27% to 33%. And in fact, I have advocated since day one in Nevada, and I've probably said it in Colorado, is that we should be reporting ranges, not an absolute value, because of all of the components that add up to your measurement uncertainty. And I would also like to say that one of the biggest contributors to the difference between labs is which certified reference standards they're using. A colleague of mine, Brianna Cassidy, who's the lab director at CDX Analytical in Massachusetts, did a comparison of 5 different companies' certified reference standards for cannabinoids, and she found a 17% difference. So you can see right there, depending on which reference standards your lab uses versus the one you were comparing it to, that could alone account for the difference in the results.
So you all touched on a very important thing, and it's statistics. Statistics can be used to kind of even out these results. A lot of labs right now are reporting things as singular true values without reporting that actual measurement uncertainty. So what do you think it'll take for labs to actually report within a range rather than a single true value?
It's going to take the regulators to allow that.
And it's going to take some public education to all of these clients that are getting the results that say, okay, what does this range mean? How do we interpret it? Why aren't we doing a single number? Because when it comes down to it, people are using this number to value the product. And so they want to value it on a single number because it's easy. But unfortunately, things don't work that way. Science doesn't work that way. Plants don't work that way. So we have to educate all of the consumers as to, okay, well, when you have a range, this is how you deal with it. This is, it's normal. It's something that should be anticipated. And, you have to account for that. Saying 25% versus 26% is not significant in any of the contexts that we're talking about, yet a lot of cultivators and dispensaries will use this as a price breaking point.
Yeah, luckily, a lot of the industry on the manufacturing side is moving towards GMP, right? And part of GMP is producing a product to specifications. Specifications obviously have a lower and an upper limit, and so the concept of these ranges, I think, is going to become more and more comfortable on the manufacturing side, making it more acceptable for us to report it from the laboratory side. So luckily, I think over time this problem will probably take care of itself. But I agree the regulators have to be the one giving us the big initial push.
Right. Nothing more to add. Essentially, it will be up to the regulators, because if you look at it this way, if Lab A is giving a certain value for a certain crop, and they additionally tested at Lab B with a higher value, well, the client tends to go with that Lab B of a certain higher percentage because, well, it's more value. So until the regulators can stop and ask for reporting in a range based on your method uncertainties, this will not change.
Another really important statistical thing that you brought up, Savino, was kind of how things are sampled before they get to the lab. So I know in California you were actually required to send a sampler, and they have to follow the internal lab SOP and make sure they get a statistically representative sample. But if you just have a client that's submitting one sample and trying to do an entire formulation on it, what would you say to them in order to get the best statistically valid sample? How would you ask them to collect their sample before it gets to your lab?
Well, if it's a flower, I would ask them to collect lots of different size buds from different parts of the plant, or if it's already mixed up, to select from different physical locations in the batch. If it were a concentrate, I'd ask them to heat it up and try to mix it and homogenize it as much as possible. Same with a liquid, and sample from different parts of that, and have them realize, hey, this is as representative a sample as we can get, but expect it to vary by this much. It may vary by 10 to 15%. So when making their formulations for edibles, take that into account and not try to be at the very edge of what's legally allowed of the 10 milligrams per edible. Just realize, hey, there's a little bit of a swing. If you try to make all of them 10, there's a possibility that one might come outside of an acceptable range. And I would try to work with them and do it multiple times so that they really get used to how to sample and how to properly submit them for testing, and then how to properly formulate their final product.
Yeah, California has pretty set rules for statistical sampling for compliance, but when it comes to R&D, it's up to the lab. And generally what we've seen is people make kilograms of oil and they have in 15 different jars, but they will bring you, a 2-gram sample from one jar, and that's not representative of the whole lot. So we usually get to each bottle, sample from each bottle homogeneously, and run that. Because what has happened many times is you sample from one jar, let's say for contaminants, it's clear of pesticides. However, because you collected different fractions through your run, certain fractions will have higher levels of certain pesticide that was in the crop, and now you've just completely missed that. And when it comes to compliance sampling, now you're statistically sampling it per California rules of about 0.3%. And now things pop up that they miss in R&D because they did not sample R&D representatively.
And in Nevada, the regulators tell us what we can take, which is 12 grams per every 5 pounds. The labs do go out and do this, collect the samples themselves. But at the site, we are supposed to just take 1 gram from 5 pounds, and that is what is analyzed for micro. So, it's very arbitrary. How that came up was based on some sampling document that somebody read about how they sample, pill manufacturers. But actually, we need to hear from Colorado, because I think Colorado finally came up with a good sampling strategy.
They did. So we have not mandatory sampling. So I, as the laboratory, almost never go out into the field and do the sampling. It's all in the manufacturers. In fact, if I offer to go do the sampling, I've never been taken up on it yet. So the samples that we get are pretty interesting in Colorado. There are some sampling SOPs that are pretty fantastic, where you take 29 half-gram samples from different points around the harvest, if it's a flower harvest, or similar statistical methods for concentrates. But almost nobody adheres to those SOPs right now, so I'll still get my one very nice green flower for potency and my one very nice brown flower for microbial testing.
Yeah.
So kind of pivoting a little bit, I just want to bring us back to one of the core tenets of good science, and that's collaboration. Obviously, to do good science, you need to collaborate with different minds, different viewpoints, kind of see problems from different perspectives and come together for a certain solution. But in the lab testing industry, it's a little bit hard to do that. A, because you can't ship samples across state lines because it's federally illegal. B, because we're actually in competition with each other rather than kind of on the same side from a business perspective. That's kind of in contrast with the spirit of science, but I think there are opportunities for labs to collaborate. I think a lot of labs just don't know about them. So are there any ways in which you think that collaboration would both help your business and help your science?
Well, I think collaboration would absolutely help in a lot of ways. One of them is being able to share data about contamination, be able to share data about some of the interferences that different instruments have with cannabis. So trying to find one pesticide in particular cannabis strains with different instrumentation, I think it would be really beneficial for some of these laboratories to share and avoid getting false positives or false negatives. And as well sharing chemical profile data, terpenes, cannabinoids, and whatever, because really, if we're really going to understand this plant, we definitely need to look at this data in a big aggregated way, and no one laboratory has enough data to really make a significant set to really tell us something about the plant. So alone, these data sets aren't worth very much, but combined, I think they can do a lot. So we need to figure out a way to incentivize laboratories to share data and then share in whatever profits can possibly come from that data.
We have 11, the number is always fluctuating, but we have 11 laboratories performing testing in Colorado at any time. We have formed a nonprofit organization actually called the Colorado Lab Council, where all of the labs meet, usually on a monthly basis, to discuss some of these issues. So that's one way that we've kind of organized a way that we can chat and keep the lines of communication open. But I personally don't believe that I'm in competition with most of the labs out there, right? I need them to exist myself, right? I couldn't do it alone. What I'm in competition with is actually just bad science, right? And so we've asked a lot of our competitors to actually come into our lab and to our laboratory, and asked to do the same of their laboratories. And so far, only 4 of the other laboratories have taken us up on that. But 4 is a lot better than 0, right? So slowly we're changing, I think, the perception of collaboration and transparency in the state.
Yeah, collaboration is very important. I mean, a prime example is Heavy Metals Talk that we just did with Kyle. Cannabis kind of prides itself and is wanting to do more of that in the future, collaborate with not just other labs, but other scientific minds. And I think it's important. However, there's a few things that kind of prevents, data sharing or analysis of data, regulations from the different states. For instance, if we want to interpret cannabinoid data, California requires moisture tests be added. So values are seemingly higher than maybe Nevada that doesn't add moisture, or terpenes are using different instrumentation. I think until we kind of get to either a compendial method or are more open with our methodology, it'll be harder to evaluate that data accordingly because of the minor differences. But it is very important in the scientific industry, obviously, to share data, but that data has to be accurate and reproducible.
And I want to add that method standardization helps that a lot. So as our methods become more standardized, we're actually able to share that data because we're not trying to protect an IP of a method where our IP is in the rest of the laboratory.
And yeah, that's true. That's true. Actually, one thing we usually encourage our clients, if they disagree with the data that I produce, I encourage them to send it to another accredited lab that is sort of trustworthy. we've compared our values. Are we looking at the same LODs, LOQs, instrumentation similar, methodology similar? I ask my clients to actually do that, and I think that's a way to kind of start to collaborate slowly, and start. Somebody I knew once said it's a co-opetition, and I think it's a very important phrase.
Yeah, for sure. The lab business, depending on where you're located, can be very cutthroat and very competitive, but I've been able to find collaborators across the country, and I feel like I have a very rich experience because I have other lab directors that I can call up and discuss certain issues. For example, getting in a new edible. Every edible we get in is like a mini research project. We have to first pry out of the producer what they use to make it, and then we basically have to deconstruct it and try and extract the cannabinoids and terpene levels that they expect to see. So I think it's changing. I think, the lab business is not the segment of the industry to be in if you're looking to make a lot of money, because it's just not happening in the lab business. So I think because of that, and we're getting a higher quality scientists involved. So scientists are just naturally curious, and they do like to collaborate because science is a layer cake, and all of these different analytes we've had to develop methods for, it works much better if you have collaborators to discuss it with.
Yeah, so from a research standpoint, you guys are actually in a unique position, because if you're doing a federally sanctioned study, you can only get raw material from one source. But you guys are actually getting things from your state that are hitting the shelves, really high quality products, and presumably clean if they're actually hitting the shelves. So do you think the labs have a certain kind of advantage in ways they can research novel ideas and new products, just because you're getting so much of these into your labs? For example, you were doing the research on heavy metals and vape. It's a really great pilot study, and what would you say to other labs to encourage them to do things similar to that?
Honestly, getting beyond simply being there to make money, you have to. Generally, scientists are here for the science. Making money is a bonus. So we have to get away from that mindset. It's cannabis, and maybe we don't care, or maybe we're here to make money. But that's not the case. In my lab, we genuinely care, and we have fun while doing it. If you ever look at an Instagram post, we have a lot of fun, but we care about the consumers and the industry. And the collaboration. I had the idea. But I give credit to Kyle and Robert, who came to me with what they wanted to do, and then we collaborated. So it's being open to people that are contacting you, or seeing what's out there. What is a consumer safety risk? What can you study that would make a difference? And I think the data that we collect in the lab kind of gives you an indication of what you can pursue next. We were getting in a lot of vape card failures in heavy metals, so something had to be done. Start to study what's going on with these vape cards. Why are they failing? So ideas like that come up, and you kind of pursue it and find some other brilliant minds to collaborate with.
Yeah, I would say, we've never had the thought of competing with manufacturers, right? But our goal is more to assist the regulators, right? We have a pretty limited list of solvents that we test for in Colorado, but analytically, it's not much of a challenge to look a little bit deeper, right? So part of the value in our data set is actually providing that for the regulators and saying, hey, maybe ethyl acetate is something we want to add to the list. We're seeing it so often and at such concentrations that it may be worthwhile, or maybe there's another solvent that we want to take off the list because we never see it. So we see our data set as being a little more valuable in that manner, that we can kind of drive public health in the direction that we want to see it go.
And I just want to add to that most analytical laboratories their main business is the product analysis. And so the time and money to do any kind of outside research is very limited. And so we cannot get to the extent that you would see at a university or anything that had outside funding for their research specifically. Usually the chemists are trying to do this in between trying to handle their clients and other samples. So I think that as the industry matures, as competition kind of falls out and the main laboratory players survive, they'll have a little bit more time and resources to dedicate to this research. And I think we'll see more and more of that as time goes on.
Yeah, and I will just say that having the ability to conduct R&D studies for our clients and things of interest to us is really what makes it palatable. And the fact that Nevada does let us use our retained product for R&D, that's a legitimate use of it. So that is one tiny sliver of brightness in this industry. And I can tell you there are endless number of experiments that could be done, and so that's exciting.
Something that's just on the horizon is hemp testing. So it's kind of like what the cannabis industry we hope will become in the future. So right now the big kind of testing consideration for hemp is that the plant material itself has to have less than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. And this is actually way more complicated than people think it is. So what kind of like technical considerations do you undertake when you're testing hemp versus cannabis?
Well, it's pretty much the same methods as you would test regular cannabis flower. You'd make some alterations to the sample prep, and that's about it, but they're very minor. What the big issue becomes is that these regulations, and they say 0.3% THC, these were set years ago when gas chromatography was the standard. And so now that the industry has evolved over the last 30 years, we need to go back and look at those and say, all right, does that mean just 0.3% THC, or is that combined THC, THCA? And I think that's how a lot of people go about it, just to be careful. But we really need to get clarification and updates on those regulations to know exactly how we should go about it. So this is a special topic for me. I'm strongly advocating for the ability to use molecular or genetic screening to distinguish industrial hemp from resin CBD hemp and drug type THC cannabis. Because what we've shown, we've actually developed a molecular assay called True Hemp ID. It's based on 2 gene SNPs that can make this distinction across these 3 groups. We've tested over 500 samples, and we have shown that what is being grown in the US right now, that 68% of it is over 0.3% THC, and the definition from the 2018 Farm Bill is decarboxylated THC, so we're talking about delta 9 plus 0.87% of THCA. And that is really shocking. I mean, you don't have to be an expert. You can drive down the road at 35 miles an hour and you can tell that is resin CBD hemp because they look like little Christmas trees. They basically look like marijuana, and it's not industrial hemp, which is more like an erect stalk. So I think this is a critical issue for the hemp industry, is that we get some alleviation from that strict 0.3% cutoff for THC. We actually are seeing that a much more reasonable cutoff is 1%, and the state of Vermont has already adopted the ability to use genetic screening as well, and we're just hoping that the federal USDA, when they release their regulations, will provide that alternative.
You know, that's a very good point, because from the testing we've done, if you take a look, if you have dried flower of the so-called hemp, most of them are over 0.3%. when it's dried and ready for consumption. Now, in the CDPH, Department of Public Health in California, set specific set of rules on how to test hemp here. And matter of fact, CannaSafe has been testing a whole lot of compliance hemp lately from the farms here. And it's easier to be less than 0.3% when you're taking into account the whole plant mass. So the CDPH says, okay, you have to dry this hemp before testing to a certain consistency till the mass stops changing, essentially, and follow through the certain procedures. But when you take the whole plant mass with the stems and everything and the leaves and test it, generally, yeah, you'll be perfectly fine with less than 0.3% THC. However, you get a dried bud, trimmed, maybe for smoking or whatever, and you will find that it will be over 0.3% THC. So how do we deal with this arbitrary number? I think, it's still a challenge.
And that reflects the older methodology that they used to use for testing cannabis that was seized by law enforcement. They used to just put the stems and seeds and everything together, grind it up. If you look at a lot of the NIDA methods from the 90s and 2000, they just ground everything up together, which is not how anybody consumes it anymore.
Right, exactly, and that's what we've been seeing. And so when you get that value, and testing by HPLC represents that acidic molecule, and you'll have people asking, well, can you run it by GC? Well, generally, people are not using GC because you want to see the full profile of the plant, but it can be done. But, it goes into what you were saying before. When you do use GC and grind everything up, there's other considerations as to whether you're actually accurately quantifying that THC with your GC and lead and derivation, whatever you got to do.
And your results are much less efficient than the 0.87 times THCA that they recommend. It winds up being more like 0.5.
Yep.
So we got time for, I think, one last question. This is something I personally wondered. What do you guys think is the most technically challenging part of cannabis testing, and where do you think the greatest demand for good scientists lies?
In the states I've worked, no doubt the most technically challenging are the pesticides, because basically you're looking for contamination that is a similar molecular weight to the actual main ingredients. And so you're looking for something in the parts per billion range in noise that is way, way higher, thousands and thousands of times higher than that. And so that becomes a bit of a challenge, and it's been a challenge in a lot of different states. They set these pesticide levels really, really low before actually testing to see whether they are actually possible with instrumentation that's currently available. And we've seen this in Nevada as well. They took Captan off the list because the state lab wasn't able to see it consistently down to the level at which they demanded everybody else do it for the last 3 years. So there's a lot of learning there, and I think to me pesticides is the most challenging, requires the most expensive instrumentation, the most extensive instrumentation, and I think the most sample prep. And then these guys could probably comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think, the battle between wanting to look as low as we can possibly look for public health versus achieving that in the laboratory is, never going to go away. But I would think, in terms of someone who I want on my team, communication to the industry is one of the most important things, right? Oftentimes in a competitive place, if you fail somebody, they're going to go somewhere else where they don't get a fail, right? So communicating that that's not a fail, that's an opportunity to improve on their manufacturing process is a delicate one, and something that's not inherent to a lot of scientists. So definitely something that we try and be really sensitive about.
I think Cindy kind of touched it in earlier. It is the various matrices that you get in. Every time, I never cease to be surprised in this industry, and it is truly a low science project each time. A week ago, we got a candle infused with CBD. So you imagine a candle infused with CBD. Now, how are you really receiving the benefits? But that's besides the point. But then testing, elucidating the CBD from this candle and all this, there's all sorts of excipients, all sorts of matrix interferences. So we have to go on low science project, bring out the chemistry book, go back into how can I extract my CBD in the midst of all these interferences with compounds that are eluding at same retention time, similar structures, conflating results. I mean, we see everything from that, toothpicks, suppository, gels, just name it. I never cease to be surprised. So it actually is what keeps this industry exciting for me, because you never know what you're going to get in the door that day. So that is a challenge on its own. And it's up to the most reputable labs or thoroughly vetted labs to be able to accurately extract and analyze these compounds in these various matrices, and that could lead to having, hundreds of SOPs depending on, what you get in the door. Water is another big one. Not only are they infusing water, but it's being encapsulated. So there are certain encapsulations that you have to break membranes to be able to get at the molecule or even concentrate down. You imagine a 8-ounce or 16-ounce bottle of water, and there's 5 milligrams of CBD in there. And so somehow you have to concentrate that, extract from the membrane, and report accurately. So some of those challenges remain, but that's what makes this work fun.
I agree with all the comments. I'm not sure I even remember the question, but there are a lot of challenging things in this industry, and when a state comes up with the list of pesticides, so on the issue of pesticides, they come up with the list of pesticides. These are the pesticides the lab is going to screen for. So great, I won't use those pesticides. There's 100 or 200 other ones. So the pesticide game is a big issue, and in Nevada, we are also actually instructed if we see another pesticide not on the list, that we're supposed to say, hey, we saw this. And in fact, we do. And it's actually, for me, it's really disappointing at the human level that growers are willing to use these pesticides, that we know they're neurotoxins. We know that no one should be inhaling them. And we see them pop up. So that's one thing that's really annoying. And disappointing. It's annoying and it's disappointing, this game that's being played with regard to pesticides. The other thing is, because the value of cannabis is based on its THC content, if a grower at some point got a 30% THCA and we come back with 28, he will go lab shopping. To get to your point, Stephen, he'll go lab shopping and he'll find a lab that will give him what value he wants, because the frailty of human nature, we see the same spectrum of personalities existing within the cannabis testing space as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. It's like you go to a doctor and he tells you have a disease, and you're like, I'll just go to a different doctor that tells me I don't have it. Well, it's just very strange. But anyway, so we're short on time. I'd like to leave the rest of the time we have to open up questions for the panelists. So if you want to make your way to the microphone, please do. But in the meantime, let's give our panelists a round of applause. I believe you were the first one up.
Good morning. Thank you for this wonderful panel. So you've been talking a lot. The title of this panel is The Future of Cannabis Testing, and we've talked a lot about measurement uncertainty and different matrix types. I was curious what you think about what labs might look like over the next 10 years. Do you think labs will start to specialize? I could easily see a lab that only does flower and concentrate, and then a lab maybe that's also registered with the FDA later, testing mostly edible products. Could you speak about how you see cannabis testing evolving over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, in every other industry, you would see labs specializing. You'd see a lab specializing in doing pesticide testing. You'd see a lab specializing in doing this and that. And if you submit your stuff to a lab, they could sub out to other laboratories. That's how you would see it in environmental testing a lot. A lot of states, especially California, has specifically prohibited that. But I think we'll see over the years that starting to change and having it start to mimic what we see in other industries.
For sure, and a lot of the ways labs can distinguish themselves is by offering other value-added tests. So I think you'll start to see a lot of diversification that way. Some labs that will do lipidomics, some labs that will do full smoke and vapor testing, and everything down the line there.
Most definitely, once it becomes federally legal, it essentially will be necessary. There's really no other industry where you're forced to use all this different instrumentation in one space and still report those results within 2 days. It'll change.
I think we'll see centralized lab testing, because the way it's set up now, it's really rather absurd that at a minimum, you need $2 million just for the basic instrumentation. The spectrum of tests that have to be carried out is extreme. So centralized testing, I think, will also see an expansion of genotyping testing. I mean, at DigiPath, we do a lot of genotyping. We do SNP analysis. So as growers want to protect their IP or defend the fact that this really is Blue Dream, there'll be more mandatory genotyping, I believe.
Thanks.
On the left. Sorry, our left.
Hi, my name is Kira. 2 quick questions. In the state of California specifically, it states in the BCC that we have to take up to 32 increments whenever you're sampling a large batch of flour up to 50 pounds. Realistically, are you going looking at this 50-pound batch after you confirm that it is indeed 50 pounds and taking 32 increments where we have this competition between labs that you only see them taking 11 grams to 13 grams in order to complete a full panel?
Well, you do have to take those increments, and we actually do, and a lab should be recording those increments. Now, you're not necessarily going to weigh their 50 pounds because you're not carrying that scale. So you have to rely on the track and trace system, such as Metric, that they are following those rules. We can't police all of that, but you have to take those increments, and you really need that mass based on what the BCC has now required. half-gram minimum sample mass for each analytical test. You'll find that you'll quickly run out of that half mass, especially if you have to do replicate analysis, which have to be in duplicate and have to concur. And if they don't concur, you have to repeat that. So if a lab is not taking the required amount, well, it's bad news for them. And
yeah, for sure. Thank you. Second question, really quick. What would you all look for inside of a compliance officer for your laboratory? Because some consultants are kind of saying that compliance is not science, which is absolutely absurd. It makes no sense inside of an analytical lab. But I've also seen the other spectrum where the compliance officer is like a full PhD statistician modeling algorithms for diabetes, and their communication style isn't necessarily the best either. So what would be your sweet spot for your compliance officer?
Well, you definitely want someone who has experience either doing compliance for a laboratory or working or running a laboratory to the degree that they were themselves tracking all of this information that's required to be tracked. You definitely need some science literacy to be able to do this, or either that, or if you have just compliance experience, you need a lot of training to be able to fully comprehend all of this data that's coming through and then check it every day, because as a compliance officer, you're going to be checking every single result that goes out and trying to catch mistakes that either the director didn't catch or the technician, and you're playing devil's advocate you're pretending to be the state and saying, okay, if I were going through this, what would I try to point out? Where are all the possible mistakes that could have happened here?
Oh yeah, it's very important. I mean, at Cannabis, we have more than one compliance officer, and you need a high-level person. You're talking about the state requires that you produce a data packet per sample that you produce out there. And the data packet includes chromatograms, your raw data, your bench sheets, everything. So you have this essentially 100-page packet per sample that you receive in. And for a lab that tests over 100 samples a day, you can imagine what kind of work that takes. So you need a team and not just any, Joe from the street being your compliance officer.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
I think we only have time for one more question.
Hello, my name is Christian Saucier. My question is, we've heard over the last 2 days a lot of call-outs for more collaboration across competitors about data, and more specifically even cross borders. A lot of this is relevant to clinical research, obviously. You guys are potentially more on the consumer side, but are your labs involved? Are you seeing any sort of meaningful industry-wide effort for third-party, independent third-party, obviously, to help collaborate all this, that can help you aggregate and while you retain ownership of it, but help you as labs to aggregate your data together so we can do proper analytics in the future around it?
Yes, we certainly are. I mean, we ourselves have published 2 or 3 papers on large data sets where we've analyzed the cannabinoid content versus the terpene, and obviously the terpene profiles are way more informative than the cannabinoid. But as a third party, companies like Leafly or even
Confident Cannabis.
Weedmaps? No.
Confident
Cannabis. They're making efforts on comparing data sets across the country. Actually, even the Emerald tests, when they do these blinded tests where they send out blinded samples and then you see where you come in across all of your peers, and they have the median and the distribution. And so little snippets of data like that are incredibly informative. But one of the barriers to combining and compiling all of this data from different labs is the fact that we're using different certified reference standards. We're dealing with this confusion of strain naming, where growers will change the name of the strain from when you pick up the sample before you get back to the lab. And so strain names don't necessarily have as much meaning as they may have at one time. Therefore, the importance and need to move toward incorporation of genetic testing with all of these samples. But the effort is happening.
Yeah, and I think the market is starting to demand it more and more. We're starting to see demands from cultivators, manufacturers to sort of get together and see, okay, how can you make your methods be more similar such that the data can be aggregated, such that if we take something from here and test it here and here, that the results will be not exactly the same, but at least within a reasonable swing. And I think it'll happen more and more as the industry grows and as everybody's data set gets kind of bigger, and as you have larger companies, corporations that until now haven't been getting into cannabis because of the federal ban on it. You'll see them get into banking now. They'll have their bank accounts, they'll be able to get into this industry, and then they'll be able to purchase these data sets or at least work with these other laboratories to learn what they learn. And once there is a financial incentive, I think you'll see a lot more people collaborating.
Right on. Well, that's all the time we have. We won't keep you from lunch, but ladies and gentlemen, our panelists, give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.